Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I am the Vice President of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. All right, on this morning's show, we're going to talk about, is America becoming less religious? And here to discuss that with me, I have three guests with me. And I'd just like to have each one of you just introduce yourself and tell us why this subject is important to you.
I'll start. I'm Pastor Craig Brown. I'm with First Lutheran Church in downtown Cedar Rapids. Obviously, being a pastor, seeing less people in the pews, it's critical for the life of our church and every congregation.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Alison Bianchi. I am an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Iowa. But I also teach sociology of religion there. I was trained in the sociology of religion in my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Notre Dame. And it's important to me because religion is still, despite what we might debate today, is still one of the principal organizing social forces in our world. So, as a sociologist, I better know what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you for coming on, Alison.
Hello, I'm Peter Jauhiainen. I teach religion at Kirkwood Community College. I have a specialty in American religious history, and so it's interesting for me, especially I have a strong interest in current trends and what's going on with younger Americans and the growth of the unaffiliated, so this topic is very interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for joining me this morning, and certainly that we're going to have a lot to talk about here. So I was thinking about planning this show and just doing research online and just a little bit about myself for transparency. I grew up very religious, and in 2008 I for lack of a better term had a crisis of faith and fell away from being classically religious, and so I consider myself part of the nuns today. But it's very interesting for me to kind of explore why stuff like this happens, because on a macro scale it's numbers, it's statistics, but individually it can really impact people's lives in different ways, and I think it's fascinating to see what's driving some of these trends and ultimately what we'll talk about, maybe its impact on society. So I think what we want to do first, because I was talking to people about this show, and I'd always, I've heard people say, well, they may not go to church, but they're certainly doing religious things. They're watching football religiously, or they're practicing yoga religiously. So aren't people just still very religious, but just in a different way? And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of level set with, what do we mean by the word religious? And maybe Craig, I'll start with you. How do you define the word religious in your mind?
I'll probably have a different take than the rest of the panel, but to me, everyone is religious. And that religion it was defined to me as the study for meaning in life. Why are we here? What is the purpose of our being here? And that study or that quandary, that search for truth, that is religious. That is someone who's religious. So to me, I think we're talking about probably more organized religion. But to me, everyone is religious in that respect.
And I think it might be helpful at this point just to read a couple statistics to see. So the Pew and Gallup have done multiple studies over the years, and I think their last one was from last year, but just a few quickly here. Half of Americans are church members. That's down. So 50% of Americans are church members, down from 70% in 1999. So that's a 20% decrease, very significant. They say most of the decline is attributable to the increase in percentage with no religion. I think, Alison, you'll have some comments on that.
Sure.
Since the turn of the century, roughly 20 years ago now, the percentage of U.S. adults with no religious affiliation has more than doubled from 8% to 19%. Also, since the turn of the century, 73% of U.S. adults with a religious preference belong to a church, compared with 64% today. And what's interesting is that seems to cut across all the generations, right? There's a significant decline. It certainly seems to be, really exaggerated amongst the millennials, but it seems to be agnostic as it pertains to the generations. But I do want to get back to Alison, your thoughts on what does it mean for a person to be religious?
Right, so there's a lot of the classic sociological definitions of this. Emil Durkheim, not to be too pedantic here, but he started with this notion that you're in a moral community that expresses themselves for something bigger than themselves, something transcendent. We talked about being, some people call this God, some people call it a higher power or something like that. But even that nowadays is controversial because a lot of people practice religion by themselves. And there's a significant, for example, pagan and Wiccan community in the United States in which their practice is very much solitary. So when we talk about what is religious, you may also, when you're talking to millennials, for example, you may want to ask, are you a spiritual person? Because many people nowadays associate being religious with being religiously affiliated to one of the, like the mainline churches, temples, or mosques. And so if you ask somebody if they're a spiritual person, that's a different, it has a different connotation. And I think more people who aren't affiliated, so for example, the nuns might, not all of them, but might say that they're spiritual people but not religious people. And it's a it's a very, very different a way of kind of defining that, but it's still, I would argue, it's still religious expression.
That's what speaks to my point, is that I think the, Americans, particularly millennials, have a mistrust with organized institutions. So we see mistrust in government, our president, what is he tweeting? Can we even trust this joker? We see, our churches, any organized institution, it's like, I don't know about that. Are they lying to me? What are they trying to push on me?
Right.
But when we talk about, are you religious? Are you seeking? Are you spiritual? Yes, I think it's still, the human heart is still there wondering what it's all about.
And even there's a really interesting phenomenon going out called the Sunday Assembly. And this is a group of atheists that meet on Sunday mornings to express their moral community. And if you watch, if you don't listen to the exact words, you just watch, it looks like a church gathering. And so there is still this kind of need for spiritual expression within a community, I think, even for those who say that they're atheists. And some of the stats that you cite, which I believe them, they're done by very reputable people, they don't capture the nuances of spirituality and the way in which Americans kind of construct their religious identity.
So what I'm hearing from you two is certainly the way we define what it means to be religious is changing. I think that's an irrefutable
hugely changing.
fact. And it seems like we're moving away from the traditional organized religions where we go on Sunday morning and you know, so that I think for sure is changing or decreasing, but that is, and we'll get into it, maybe what is replacing it, is it sufficient? But Peter, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on what you think it means to be religious and how we define that word.
Well, it's tricky because we're getting at kind of two different broad definitions. You know, the American theologian Paul Tillich defined religion as ultimate concern. Well, then that would kind of meet Craig's definition that everyone is religious. Everybody has an ultimate concern.
Absolutely.
Well, it could be money, right? And if that's the case, you could say that the American religion is money, right, or the pursuit of wealth. But historically, I mean, that doesn't define the historical organized religions. And so when I teach world religions or you know, Eastern, Western thought, I think of it in terms of, well, human involvement with some realm that they consider to be the sacred. Usually it's expressed in community, usually it's expressed in ritual forms, usually there's a kind of system of symbols with deep meaning that impacts the lives of people. You know, and usually it involves some sort of pathway, some sort of path towards an ultimate transformation. So you don't have to have a God, you don't have to have any kind of deity in order to be religious in that sense. But I do think that among a lot of Americans today, and especially the younger generations, they're looking for a new terminology. The terminology of religious doesn't fit them, so they often say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. And they associate religion with institutions, with the church, right? And they don't want to belong to organizations.
Which is
they don't
failing.
want institutionalization.
And many of us,
Yeah, and they point to the mistrust in institutions as one of the causal factors for why people are moving away. So I think the qualifier here is that we're talking about a decline in, classic organized religion, right? That's what we're talking about here for the sake of this conversation. So I guess what I want to do maybe now is just let's talk about a few of the factors that are contributing to that. And so there was one particular professor that I was reading online, and I'd seen it in a few different places, where he really looks at 3 different factors he feels, since you can kind of see a trend since the 70s and 80s with a real steep decline in the early 90s all the way till today. But he points to 3 kind of watershed events, and that was essentially the association with the Republican Party with conservative Christianity in the 70s and 80s, focus on the family, moral majority, etc. The fall of the Soviet Union and its association with atheism or just no religion in general, and then also 9/11, which we saw kind of, how people were radicalized by a particular religious ideology. But I'd wonder, do you agree maybe with that assessment at all, or do you feel like maybe there are some, there's something contributing to it, right? There's some societal factor. So I thought it'd be interesting to weigh in on what you think about that, and then anything beyond it.
Well, in terms of the USSR, when that fell, and anywhere we see pockets of communism where religion has been stymied, organized religion, we see it flourishing. My sister just got back from a trip to Vietnam, and they checked all their passports and the government watched them very closely. They said you can't go approach people about God or anything, but they can come talk to you. And if they do, you can't talk to them in the streets. But if you go into their hotel room, then they could have those discussions. And the underground church was just flourishing. And it's hard to track those numbers, but again, the desire is there for faith, and we're seeing those explosions in those places.
Right. And 9/11's tricky because yes, it was definitely done by individuals radicalized by, I wouldn't say by their religion, but radicalized by their political things in the name of their religion. We have to be careful with that. But those that experienced 9/11 actually went in 2 different directions. There were many that lost their religion. Seeing the towers fall, seeing all the horrible things happen to their loved ones, they questioned why is God letting this happen, and they really lost their faith. But then there was also another side, a very significant side, that when this happened, they came back to their faith because it comforted them, it gave them whatever meaning you can pull out of tragedy. Oftentimes a religious experience and expression and community can help you find that meaning. And so 9/11 had multiple things, factors contribute. So I wouldn't just focus on those that perpetrated, but the consequences of that is a trickier story.
I mean, I agree that certainly it impacted people in different ways,
Right.
for sure.
I do think there's a lot of merit to the suggestion that when you look at the polling data of the rise of the unaffiliated, all of a sudden in the 1990s you see a huge spike. And then it kind of levels off after 2001, and then it rises again after about 2005. And so in the 1990s, sociologists have been wondering, okay, why is there this big spike? And I think there is something to that suggestion that one of the reasons given is there's been this political backlash. You see this, the moral majority became a major force in the Republican Party. Really by about 1990, the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson, and the Republican Party platform almost become coterminous. I mean, they're almost identical in their shared concerns. And you see a lot of, two issues that are used as big cultural wedge issues is the anti-gay rights and then the abortion issue. And so there have been some studies that have suggested that, especially for a lot of younger Americans, but for Americans in general, this wedding of religion and politics, especially in the Republican Party and the Christian conservatives and the takeover of the Republican Party, that's been a major causal factor for a lot of people to say that, well, if that's what Christianity is all about, I want to have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I want to actually, of all the 3 factors that you named, I would absolutely say that the polarization of our politics has been a huge contributing factor to individuals not wanting to affiliate to a lot of, especially the mainline Protestant and Catholic faiths. And so, yes, I often, when the students come into my class, they often know the truism that religion's not good for government, right? You know, you should have this kind of separation of church and state. But I leave them with trying to make them understand that government's not good for religion either. There's a mixture of this kind of political expression and religious expression that creates a rigidity in your political identity, and it makes you uncompromising, and it makes it very, very difficult for those who want more variability in their experience, which is certainly the millennials that don't want to be included in any institutions. It makes it very, very difficult for them to want to affiliate with these kind of religions, the parts of the religions rather that are polarized, because the religions themselves are become polarized. The Catholic Church is very polarized. Many of these mainline Protestant groups are very polarized themselves. And so it creates this tension where younger people just don't want to affiliate.
And I think, so one thought I had too, and certainly not my thought exclusively, but just this idea that people have more to do in today's world than maybe they have in past generations. As a sociologist, I mean, how do you study that? How do you view that? Do you think there's some significance to that idea that just people, you know, can go online and, you know, listen to a podcast and can have an online guru potentially, you know, they have, you know, apps to connect to people, social media. I mean, there's just a plethora of ways to connect into a community over a shared interest, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be, you know, religious in nature, and by default, people are moving away from religion.
This is one of the main theories of one of the big sociologists in religion, Rodney Stark. He will tell you that we only have so much time in the day, and there's a lot of competition for our time these days, and we are working much longer hours. Julia Shore will tell you we're the overworked Americans. We just, you know, we just don't have as much time to do the things we want to do. And so, yeah, there are these kind of new outlets for religious expression that maybe some wouldn't call a religious experience. There are virtual churches, for example. You can go online and it's almost like the simulation where you sit down in a pew, you create your own character, and it's and is that a religious experience? I don't know. And podcasting, YouTube, and other kind of outlets also seem to satisfy a lot of the religious expression
and
of
they
others.
Don't come with a lot of strings attached, right? I don't necessarily have to financially give to it.
That's
I don't have to commit a lot of time and energy into that.
I don't have to drive there. I don't have to do, you know, exactly. And so, yeah, it matters.
Craig, I mean, you're front lines with this, right? I mean, you're dealing with this every day. Do you, I mean, are you seeing it? I mean, are you having to, when it comes, you know, younger generations especially?
But I think the biggest factor is one we haven't mentioned, which is the breakdown of the family.
Okay.
That's what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. You know, where are the dads? Where is the family unit? Where's the sense of, you know, we're getting in the car and we're going to do this. We're going to, you know, try to be better people and help one another. That's just gone. We used to have that when, you know, guys came home from World War II, men and women came home, you know, it's the service clubs flourished, the Lions Club, the, you know, the Kiwanis, and churches flourished because it was a sense of service they brought home with them. And there was a sense of family, and this is what we do, and we trust these institutions. They're here to help other people, and for us to learn how to help other people. And that's kind of dissipated. I've got my wife is a teacher, and she's trying to instill ethics in these kids the best she can from her own Christian perspective. And they make headway, these teachers, just trying to be good, ethical people. But they're dealing with kids that haven't slept all night because there's no one home watching them. Yeah. You know, and they haven't eaten, and they don't have the basics needs. And then you come and, tell me about good, right, and wrong. I want to go take a nap. You know.
Well, this is a good segue then into, you know, one of my questions here, which is, you know, the fear is, and Peter and I were on an episode several years ago where we talked about being good without God, right? So I consider myself a secular humanist, you know, non-religious, depending on how we define it. But, you know, the fear is, of course, and I think you're hinting at it, is that, you know, if we become more non-religious or stop going to church or whatever, that, you know, that's going to contribute to the moral rot of our society, for lack of a better term.
I think it has.
Okay.
I think we're living.
Peter, do you agree with that assessment, that it's contributed to the moral rot of our society?
Well, there's two sides of that. I mean, on the one hand, the most highly religiously committed are the most supportive of the moral rot in the White House right now. I mean, by all objective standards about, you know, common standards of morality, So you could argue, so what's the correlation between high religious commitment and this ardent support for what's going on in the White House? I mean, on the flip side, I do know that sociologists are very concerned about the loss of social capital.
Right.
Because people who belong to churches tend to volunteer more, they give more of their time, people who belong to religious organizations in general. So there's two sides to that coin. On the one hand, people who are committed to these institutions tend to really give a lot of time to their communities. On the other hand, some of the most highly committed, maybe they're contributing to the moral rot of our society.
Yeah,
right now
so,
as well.
and I think that's a whole other, I have kind of my ideas around that, but that will get us off in a lot of other stuff. So, you know, I did an episode on, you know, is the world becoming a better place? Steven Pinker, the renowned professor of, Enlightenment Now, you're probably all familiar with that book. It basically argues for the fact that society is getting better, and if you look at the statistics, it's almost irrefutable that really since the early 90s and prior to that, rates of violence of every kind, you know, child poverty, infant mortality, teenage pregnancy, I mean, it just goes down the line is just dropping off. And so, you know, from my perspective, I would say, well, that's interesting. You know, not that there's correlation is causation by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're saying that it would contribute to moral rot, I would say, well, we see a decline in all those while at the same time becoming less religious. So that seems to run counter to that. But I wonder maybe what your thoughts are.
My kids, I have 3 boys
Yeah.
under the age of 12, and my kids are trained to what happens if someone wants to come in their school and kill them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're there. You know, we're there, and we also belong in the Boy Scouts, and our Boy Scout troop is burgeoning and just one of the fastest growing in the state. And these parents and families are looking for these ethics, this ethos of helping one another, of you know, standing up for one another. Gen Z, let's skip over millennials and go to Gen Z. Gen Z's #1 concern is bullying, is addressing bullying, and the #2 is belonging. And I think we've got that in the church. We stand up, we believe in a God in Jesus Christ who came to this world, who said, listen, I love you and I love all people. We're going to include everyone in here.
Yeah.
So let's stand up and stand up to bullies and stand up to people who are picking on others, whether they're in the White House or they're, you know, in the next door, or they're in a foreign country. We love and stand up for those people. And then to create a sense of belonging where we can all belong, no matter what your beliefs are. Whether you're an atheist, you know, a non-believer, a Lutheran, Catholic, none of the above, you know. Where do we have that sense of belonging?
Yeah,
And
no, I think...
To me, in my perspective, God came to the world to do that for all of us in Christ.
No, I think the power of, you know, Jordan Peterson, the Canadian professor, talks a lot about that, just the power of a story and how religion has given us that, the framework of which to live our lives, create meaning, purpose, a sense of morality, etc. So assuming we do become, you know, less and less religious as the generations go on, which it kind of looks that way, if you know, but assume that's the case, all right? Who knows? But assuming the case, what do we replace organized traditional religion and its stories and its value that's given to society? How do we replace it, or do we not? I mean, is there...
To me, it's a both and. You have to do both at the same time. So our congregation's wrestling with how do we serve the traditional, you know, older audience, more traditional audience. I would throw myself in that at 44. And then how do we also be a new church that serves a new way of thinking, where we don't ask people to come on Sunday morning, but we instill faith in them so that they can go out and be the church into the world. Yeah. And I'm not worried about the decline. My gosh, Christianity alone, one world religion I understand, has been around for 2,000 years and seen a lot more trials than we're going through now. Sure. There's ebbs and flows, and I'm confident we'll get things back on track.
Yeah, it could be cyclical, and I mean certainly Christianity has changed over the millennia, right? And it's adopted to society and its sense of, it's kind of the zeitgeist and all kinds of stuff. So, but getting back to this idea of how you know, if there is a vacuum there when it comes to religion, what are people filling it with?
And that's a really good question. I think that. You know, I think that people are getting their sense of morality from multiple kinds of sources. And, you know, I think Craig was absolutely right that the institutions themselves are really declining right now, and there's just a really big shift. I mean, sociologists will probably tell you we're in our second industrial revolution, and this is kind of what it looked like when they pulled people off the farm and threw them in the city, and suddenly everything changed. Well, nowadays we're having this revolution with technology, and it's changing a lot of things in a lot of institutions. Does this mean the end of religion? The secularization theorists since the 1850s have been saying religion's going to die, and it hasn't died. But interestingly, people, the New York Times had a really, really interesting article which had a very kind of alarmist title, just to get everyone to read it, that said, if we keep this up, there's 38 more Easters. And I thought that was, it was a brilliant thing, because I'm like, everyone's going to read that article, because that's really, you know, but I just don't foresee the end of religion. What I do foresee is kind of this, Americans are really good at changing things in institutions and creating like really interesting kind of perspectives. I do see a kind of realignment in how it is that we affiliate. It's not just going to be within one institution or another, but we're going to create this kind of eclectic feel of different ways of expressing our religion. And you know, there is a kind of a baseline virtue that is shared by all the religions, and it goes something like this. Treat others as you would like to be treated. It's a commonality in just about, I don't want to say universally, because, you know, social scientists aren't supposed to do that, but it's a commonality in just about every religious tradition that I've read about, and I'm sure that you would agree, Craig. And so if in fact that's a virtue that we value in society, when I would just call it plain old-fashioned empathy, then I do think that there's going to be ways in which we teach that, ways in which we express that in a transcendent way. It'll exist for all time. I will say one thing, too, which is kind of out there, but I think you might find it interesting. People who are studying chimpanzees in the wild right now are finding that they are doing religious rituals. So this might be something that I mean, this is something, if Steve Pinker was here right now, I'd love to debate with him. We may just be, because of our language and because of our need for groups, we just may be people that need to express, or a species that need to express our religion. And so because of that, I don't know. I don't think it's the end of religion in any way.
Well, it's probably the continued evolution of it, and nobody can predict where it will go. I mean, we all kind of have our ideas and biases probably when evaluating. So we have just a little over a minute, and Peter, I'm going to give you the last word because I know you've got plenty to say on this subject when it comes to the secularization of our country, and maybe some thoughts you have on why you think it's going that direction, or where you see it going maybe.
I think, you know, you mentioned the Cold War earlier and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it's just become culturally more accepted for people to say, you know, I'm just not religious. I don't want to go to some institution. I don't want some church or some other institution to tell me how I need to live my life. And so I do think that we are in a culture now. You know, during the Cold War, it was the God-fearing Americans versus the godless Soviets, right? That Cold War is over. And so I do think we now live in a more culturally accepting society where it's okay for people to say, I'm a good human being, I'm going to be a good moral human being. If you believe in God, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine as well. And I think that's, and there's that kind of eclectic mixing that you see with a lot of young people mixing from different traditions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for joining us. And as usual, we've run out of time.
We've solved it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, thank you. And I appreciate everybody joining in this morning and hope you have a great Sunday. Take care now. Bye.